So rather than think of social determinants, the idea of determinant to me seems fixed, but is not fixed. These are things that are forces, and I like to call them social forces. We at PIH often call them social forces because they have a direction and they have a magnitude. Which ways do they push people to have bad health, and how hard do they push, right? So you can have something that's a force that makes you very, very sick, and we saw this with COVID. If you were not able to work from home, if you were a migrant laborer and you had to work every day in groups, you were much more likely to get COVID, right? If you were somebody like me who could work behind a computer, much less likely to get COVID. So that had a very strong social force on who lived and who died in the pandemic. And I think many of you experienced those disparities. So one of the things we ask you to do and think about when you are analyzing a person before you or a community is map out these social forces and try to understand, are they very strong? Are they very weak? And then the important thing is we can push back on those forces. So if you think of government support for health, in countries like the United States, where we had many, many millions of people uninsured, the passage of what we call Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act actually made fewer people uninsured. So that is going to improve health, and we know it did. Other things like the forces of capitalism that have outweighed public health. We know for something very simple, such as cigarette ads, when cigarette ads were marketed in communities of color or in impoverished countries, it increased smoking and that harmed public health, right? Gender equity. In countries that have higher gender equity, women have access to primary and secondary care, women hold seats in government, that women do better. And then, of course, the force of racism, which is the purposeful impoverishment, exclusion, discrimination against people for the color of their skin. These underlie many, many social forces. So how do we push back? How do we make something less impactful on bad health or more impactful on good health? That is what we want to do when we think about social forces, not just tick them off and say, oh, food, housing, etc., but rather then what do we do about them for an individual and also for a community? So remembering that social inequities are structured, and Paul Farmer used to talk about this as structural violence. This is structured into the society we live in. We know that human history has been and continues to be marred by war and oppression, and that is one of the most profound social forces that causes death and ill health. But there are those who try to create difference to justify their own actions, and these differences are created race and religion, ethnicity, gender, and that these are then structured into society and actively enforced through policies and practices. So remember, I showed that map of Boston. We had a practice in the United States in the 1950s, 40s and 50s called redlining, which is if you lived in a neighborhood that was mostly black, the banks would put a red line around that and say you cannot get a mortgage, because they thought that these people who lived there, mostly black people, wouldn't pay back their mortgage. The infrastructure of the community was not good enough to support home ownership, etc. So people were systematically excluded, and those structures became baked in to these impoverished communities, because once you have less home ownership, then you don't have property tax. The property tax goes to pay for the schools and the roads and other things. So it becomes a vicious cycle that is structured in by these policies. So important to map them, and then important to go back and try to understand the history of what got us there, so that if we are going to work to undo those things, we know what we're up against and we can take the right action.